Thanks very much. And thanks everyone for hanging in to the end. It's been a long 2 weeks already, and we're well into the second week. So thanks for staying with us all the way. So I think quite a bit of what I'm going to talk about now, we've already discussed in various forms. So I hope this will help you to have a kind of general wrap around how data governance works and where ethics fits into that and how it comes together. So I don't think I need to remind you, these are the basic background points, that we're having these increased data volumes. And it's fantastic because it gives us increased opportunities for making evidence-based decisions for healthcare. But we also have this increased risk of data breach and privacy violation. And one of the things that we've really found working in Africa is that we have these very vulnerable populations across the continent, and they're not well positioned to be able to kind of advocate for data protections or to be able to negotiate better protection of their data. So this adds another layer of responsibility working with data from potentially vulnerable populations. So what I'm going to present here now is actually a framework that we published some time ago, but I think is still very relevant. We tried to think about what are the pieces that go together to make up data governance. And the idea of the framework, we did this actually for digital health data. That was our kind of use case, where we had these flows coming from apps in the field. And you know, with those kind of digital health data, every time a package of data moves from one stage to the next, there's this increased risk of breach. So the question was very much, how can we think holistically about making sure that we look after the data well and that we protect the participants who've provided these data? So it is published and hopefully is a useful tool if you're struggling to put together a kind of data governance framework. And I've been using this framework for several years in different contexts, and I find generally it still remains applicable. Within each of the pillars, you can work out what's relevant to your domain. In our framework, we identified these 4 main pillars. When I say pillars, I mean they're 4 parallel work streams when you're building a data governance framework for whatever project you're working on. So this is my way of organizing the thinking, myself and my co-authors, and other people may do it differently. So some people put, for example, ethics and consent, a subset of that would be governance, or ethics. But for myself, I found that ethics and consent fits as one of the pieces that together make up a data governance infrastructure. And then cross-cutting, you have, this idea of data governance. It's kind of quite an esoteric idea, data governance. You have the different pieces that create a data governance framework, but overarching these, you have oversight and enforcement. So of each of these components, you still need to have a way to monitor whether those are being managed or not. And then hopefully, if you can pull this whole framework together, you end up with participant protection, but also being able to use the data because you trust the system that you're working in for protection of the data. So you want to maximize the benefits of collecting the data by having this very well structured governance framework. So I thought I would just talk through them all. I'm not going to go over in detail those that we've already covered or other speakers have covered. I'm hoping that your takeaway from this is more of an overview of how, if you wanted to, for example, review the governance for your own data sets or your own data ecosystem, that you might be able to take this and use it to guide you as you review and check in on your own governance structures. So I don't think we'll need to go into huge amounts of detail in the areas that we've already had some great discussion. So I'm going to talk about the 4 different pillars: ethics and informed consent, legislation, data access controls, and sustainability. So I'll go through each one individually. So ethics and informed consent, we've had some great discussions already. But one of the things that I hear often is people saying, oh, I have to get ethics for my project. What they mean is they have to send their project through the ethics review board. and depending on your institution, that can be an extremely painful, or if you're lucky, a slightly less painful process. But it involves lots of forms, lots of talking about risks and identifying who's in your study and what their specific risks might be and what you've done to mitigate those risks. But ethics is, for a study, is really not about that process. That's about the ethics review with the committee that oversees your work, which is essential. It's very important. But ethics is really more about how are you protecting your participants and how are you protecting the communities that they're in, and how are you ensuring that the benefits of your research that you're planning to do outweigh the risks. And I really enjoyed the scale of, what's risky and how much are the benefits that we're going to get back. So you're always trying to titrate those two against each other and make sure that that there's an appropriate ratio between the risks and the benefits. If you remember, I had that slide with the tug of war between the two, and it's about finding the balance. So it's really, ethics is not about, can I get to do the cool research I want to do? And as data scientists, we sometimes, especially in the health space with very big data, we forget that those are real people facing real crises, real health problems, real challenges, real heartbreaks. And we need to constantly bring ourselves back and remember that ethics is about representing the concerns and the care of real people. Yeah. So, yeah. So yeah, we don't just have cases and controls. We have people who have conditions and people who don't have that specific condition. They're actually humans. Yeah. And if we didn't have research participants who were willing to put themselves into our hands and trust us with their data, we wouldn't be able to do research. So we should really, really uphold the trust put in us. So when we protect the participant, we've talked about many of these things. Confidentiality is a huge important component. Beneficence is ensuring that there are benefits that come to those individuals, recognizing potential harms, and then also identifying whether you're working with vulnerable populations. And vulnerable populations can be, there's some very well-recognized vulnerable populations. For example, minors, people who are under 18 years of age are considered in a special category when you think about ethical concerns. Maybe people who are who don't have the mental capacity to make informed decisions about what happens to them in terms of medical care, they would be recognized as a vulnerable population. But actually, certainly for us in Africa, working in Africa, there are very many populations who are vulnerable because they may have poor health or high health challenges and high health burden, have a low socioeconomic status. A large proportion of the population may be low SES. And then in general, there's a problem of limited access to care. So that immediately sort of skews the playing field when someone is coming into a study. And we often see that participants might confuse participating in a study with actually just getting access to healthcare. So there are a lot of extra layers that have to be considered to make sure that what you're doing is as ethical as possible in the particular context that you're working in. So sometimes if you're doing health research, your local Department of Health might also need to give approval. And especially if you're working in one of their facilities or collecting data or using data from their infrastructure. And then we've already talked at length about informed consent, anonymization, aggregation of data, all of these ways that you can ensure your data are more protected from privacy breach. Yeah. And we've already talked at length that de-identification is not equivalent to anonymization. So if you want to balance benefits and risks, you actually have to understand what creates a risk and what is considered a benefit. And people forget risks are not only risks to participants, but also to researchers. So for example, if researchers are dealing with people who have very difficult health conditions, and I think we saw a lot of this during the pandemic, it can be very traumatic for researchers actually to be interviewing and engaging with people who are struggling so much. Or there's also the physical risk if you're collecting samples, risk of needle sticks, those kind of things. It's not only about privacy and data protection, but there's a bigger kind of package of things, and it's important to think holistically. And in order to be able to identify these things, you have to think locally, and local context and local understanding is really very essential. Just to be appropriate on the ground and to understand what is offensive or not to your local populations, that you're working with, what does the population think is a risk or not? So it's very important to be contextual on the ground. So you need to have this local consultation with stakeholders, and that has to be from the planning stage. You can't come at the end when you've decided what you're doing, what the study's going to look like, what you're going to collect, how you're going to collect it, and then have a sort of interaction with stakeholders where you tell them what you've already decided to do. So you have to really think about who's involved on the ground from the beginning in order to make sure that you're appropriate for the work you're planning to do. And it's worth having a local ethics review board review the work. So if you have international partners, they may get their protocols approved by their ethics review board, but actually you should really be doing it with your local ethics review board who understands the context better. And you can have ethics review at more than one site. That's not an issue, but really you shouldn't be doing work for us in an African country with an ethics review done somewhere in the UK, for example. It doesn't make sense. And there's no way an ethics review board in the UK can know what the sensitivities are on the ground in an African village or an African region. Yeah. So yeah, understanding what's culturally acceptable or not acceptable, but also sensitive reporting practices to mitigate risks. I think I already told some people about dots on maps. I mentioned it here. I mean, it's actually not acceptable to put dots on maps that represent infected people who have infectious diseases, who are living in a certain region in a way that's very identifying and reporting about certain regions. It's really important to check your language, check how you describe things, check how you talk about population groups and populations. And you need to really speak to people on the ground to find out what's okay or not and what's acceptable. And then also at this early stage, you should be talking about your data sharing and your informed consent protocols. Does this work? Is it understandable? You can pilot your informed consent, the information with people in that community and say, well, you know, when you read this, is it intelligible? Does it make sense? Is the language correct? So there's a lot of prep to do. I guess that's what I'm saying. It's not something that you just, if you want to do ethical research, you don't just design a scientifically fabulous research project, you know, put it through your ethics and then appear in the community ready to collect samples and data. We already talked about consent models. What I didn't go through, we mentioned, you know, how to do tiered consent, but I just wanted to say that there are 3 main recognized models, and this just helps you to understand the language of what you're talking about when you talk about the different consent models. The broad consent model is where you sort of have one tick the box, yes, I agree that you can take my samples and data and use in the way described. And then if you're going to do a broad consent, you should have ethics review boards who are then looking at what happens with those data or biospecimens going forward. You can't just then say, well, I'm the researcher, I've got carte blanche, I can do whatever I want. Your subsequent studies should all have individual ethics approval to make sure that what you're doing fits with what was consented initially. Tiered consent we talked about already, where there are multiple questions and consents about different types of data use. And then, so it would go maybe this study, future studies on this particular condition, all health disease, all health studies going forward. You can set the different layers, and then the individuals can tick off what they're happy with and cross where they're not happy. They may not be happy for their data to go abroad, for example, so they can exclude themselves from that option. Dynamic consent, we're not ready for that, certainly where I'm working in Africa at this time. So this is where you would have a kind of online platform and your participants would be engaged with information about studies coming up, et cetera, and they would be able to opt in and opt out of studies as they go along through this kind of online interaction, maybe on a smartphone. There's this new study doing this, can we use your data and samples? And they can say yes or no. So that's actually the best model that we can aspire to. But for that, you need a really online and digitally literate research population. And that's not always practical. But hopefully in the future, we'll eventually end up there where participants have oversight of all the use of their data and can interact in a live way as new studies are planned and get involved with the decision making. So a respect for autonomy, I just wanted to use some of the language that I think is important in governance. So respect for autonomy means recognizing that every individual actually has the capacity and the right to choose how it works for them. So not making these blanket decisions in a top-down way, but ensuring that every individual gets to say how their data or their specimens are going to be used and respecting that individual right. So that means making sure that the individual can understand what's being planned and then has the option and the opportunity to express their own wishes and their own wills. And I sort of wrote about this and got quite verbal on it because I got very tired of hearing the kind of comments like, oh, well, you know, rural participants in Africa can't really understand these things. So we should make the decision for them based on our knowledge. And, you know, this kind of very condescending, patriarchal, sort of semi-neo-colonial kind of attitude is wrong. Just because someone lives in a rural village and they're not necessarily a fluent English speaker doesn't mean that they don't have the capacity and the autonomy to make their own decisions about what they can and can't do. And I think that we should never lose sight of that. If we're not able to communicate effectively with our participants, who are in most cases grown adults who have managed to live their lives very successfully and make multitudes of decisions about their lives, well, then we need to try harder. We can't just opt out and say it's too hard. So yeah, that's also why I like the tiered consent model, because I feel it breaks it down and we find it easier to explain it piece by piece. Everyone has different opinions about which models work. That's just how we prefer it. We also have to think in the respect for autonomy about returning results. And this is something that comes up in secondary use of data quite a lot. Because if you have a participant who comes for an initial study and you say, okay, we're doing a study, we're going to look at genes involved in diabetes, we explain all of those things. Maybe the participant has diabetes or their family suffer from diabetes and they're very interested. So that's very straightforward because you can define upfront what you intend to give back and you say, do you want to know if you have, you know, this gene or that gene and we know they have this effect or that effect. But then what if you have secondary use of this genetic data set and in the secondary analysis down the line, another researcher, there's a different gene that's identified that may have some risk associated. Do you return those results? Do you contact that participant? Do you tell them about it? So is it actionable? Is it not actionable? Actionable means can something be done? Can something not be done? And what if it's something that might be actionable, but in another country or only if you're very well resourced and you're wealthy? Does it count as actionable if you are relying on a government health service and the treatment is not available? So it's very nuanced, the kind of return of results, and it's a whole area of study in itself. So when you're looking at secondary analysis, you should be very aware of what return of findings you should think about and be prepared in advance. So you don't want to be working through your data and you discover that someone, you know, and I'm making up a completely trivial example, someone who is 25 years old has some genetic mutation that guarantees that they're going to be extremely ill when they're 30. And now what do you do with this information? So you need to have a plan in place about a return of results, secondary use. From secondary use specifically, you should have it in place for a primary study anyway. But secondary use data can generate some very uncomfortable dilemmas, and you need to try and preempt them and be ready. And one of the most simple ones that people have also encountered, for example, is when they do family studies. So they may have trios in the study. It's a mom, a dad, the two parents, the two biological parents and their offspring. But sometimes, and more often than we'd like to think, the family dad is not the biological dad. And maybe no one actually even knows this. So now, is that information you communicate back to the family? Is it information you keep to yourself? I don't know the answers, but I know that you need to think about these things before you collect data or before you work with data if you're doing trio studies. And you need to speak to your ethics review board, find out best practice, how you're going to handle these situations, because they can be very messy. Yeah. And the other point I just wanted to raise, so what we see a lot in the genomics world is that people collect genomic data from individuals and they talk about the health research, et cetera, et cetera. And then those data get kind of parceled off and used in addition for population diversity studies. So I don't have any problem with population diversity studies, but I kind of think if you're going to bring people on board for a project that is about health and health research, and that is very much your messaging, it's not appropriate, even under broad consent, to simply repurpose and shunt those data off to population diversity studies. And there's a sort of perception that that's like can't harm anyone. But actually, there have been quite a few studies where the populations who've had, this very public reporting on the origins of the population group actually have directly conflicted with the population's own beliefs about where they come from as a group. And then there's been this big, sort of public exposure, et cetera, and it's led to a lot of damage. So it's about being very intentional about what you're going to do and discussing it with participants and being upfront about what the risks might be. We really face this as well because across Africa, as Shakun mentioned as well, the diversity between our population groups, the genetic diversity, is really very pronounced. But there's a further layer to this because often populations, African populations, live in a geographically known area. So if I tell you about the Matabele people from Zimbabwe, I know which region those people live in. I kind of know who they are as a population group, or the Manika people, or whoever, because geographically, people, the African populations, are found in certain areas. So if I say to you there was a study of a Caucasian population, I mean, with that nomenclature, you can imagine it's anyone from the northernmost point of Canada all the way down to Australia or New Zealand, perhaps, and anywhere in between. But if I say to you the Luya people, I can pinpoint on the map where you're going to find that population in Africa. And that's very common across Africa. And there are dreadful papers out there where people report about African population groups in really horribly insensitive ways. Normally people who are not in any way, shape or form part of or related to those population groups. We've already talked a lot about anonymization, de-identification. Now, thanks to our talks, I actually added an eye to kinds of data that can't be anonymized because I hadn't thought about that, but it's very real. Remembering that anonymization, de-identification are different things and that you can't anonymize a DNA sequence or a genotype, just like you can't anonymize a fingerprint or a retinal scan. We already talked about data perturbation, I think. I don't think we need to go into there further. One of the things about DNA that I think makes it a particularly sensitive area is that we don't yet know what the potential harms might be. So, I mean, if I said to you that that I'm happy to put my genome into the open domain, and I'm okay if they discover I have a gene that predisposes me to a heart problem in my mid-50s. Is it possible, and it's a question, I don't know the answer, but is it possible that my daughter in 20 years' time will have to pay a much higher premium on her mortgage because someone has linked back her relationship to me and my genetic data, and they've seen that I have this risk. I mean, I don't think it's in the realms of science fiction to think that those things might happen. So we don't know what people are going to find out about DNA as they go. And the way we interpret DNA sequence is just improving all the time. So we don't yet even know what people can or can't tell from our DNA sequence before we put it out there into the public domain. So I like to point to this. There was a little enhancer, or I think it's an enhancer that in 1972 was junk DNA. In 1980, it was rebranded as non-coding DNA. In 1981, it became regulatory sequence. In 2010, it became an enhancer. In 2013, upgraded to super enhancer. And then by 2015, it was implicated in an autoimmune disease. But I mean, in 1972, I would have been quite happy to put my junk DNA out there on the internet, not worried about it. So we have to think about what we don't know, you know, the fact that we don't know everything, and keep that in mind. I mean, there are already all these options or concerns around the personal harm, stigma, and discrimination through re-identification, which could happen with data breach, genetic data, genomic data, and sensitive clinical data, especially granular data. But there are also community harms, and I started talking about those, about African populations that are genetically very distinct, and how you can associate genotypes with specific groups. And there are these infamous examples of really quite offensive publications that have made it into the Natures and Sciences, etc., that have really reported in very unacceptable ways on African populations. And they're very othering. It's always about they, that African population, they do this and they do that in very blanket terms, yeah. Yeah, so it's about asking and discussing, ensuring that your work is going to be acceptable, promoting global equity. These are all the ways that you can engage with the community. This is also at the level of ensuring that you have engagement with researchers at the point where the work is taking place. So this was the sort of helicopter science model that I was talking about on Monday, where you have no one from the local population where the study's taken place represented on the paper. So if I get asked to review any papers that look like that, I decline, but I decline and write to the editor and say, I decline to review any papers where there's such clear global inequity and indications of helicopter science. I don't hold back in terms of really flagging that it's not acceptable and I won't review it accordingly. Yeah, so part of the community engagement process when you want to do these big studies and collect all these data is also to discuss how the data and biospecimens will be used after the study. How will they be stored? Who will have control of them? And these are all things that should be planned and part of the study. You can't add them on later. You need to budget for them. You need to put focus groups into your budgets. You need to make sure that you have the right kind of people who can run focus groups and can make these things happen. So this is a checklist I put together, probably after reading some paper that made me particularly irritable. The checklist, the first question is, does the population under study benefit from the research you're doing? And if you're just doing a genetic genomic research study of a particular population because you had the samples in the freezer with broad consent and you thought it would be cool, well, actually the answer is no, and you shouldn't be doing that work. Yeah. If there's a benefit of some sort to be gained, then great. So ask yourself very consciously about what the population under study is getting out of this. And do they have risks associated with the research? And you may need to speak to anthropologists, or you may need to speak not only to the people on the ground, but to ethicists who have some experience identifying these risks. Another question, are the researchers from the population under study properly involved in leading, conducting, and reporting the research at all levels? Do you know what this population thinks about your research plan and findings? And if your answer is no, then it's time to get onto it and find out. What do local people say about risks from this research, especially risks of denigration, labeling, stigma, xenophobia, ethnic violence, or unwanted attention? And again, if you don't know the answer or about what local people say about these things, it's also time to find out before you get out there. And then, does it add value to identify the specific population in your reporting? Would a regional or national identity be sufficient? So first of all, the first thing I would say, and I'm speaking very much with an African lens here, you do not need to, and I always pick on the Matabele people because I'm Zimbabwean. So I'm not picking on them for any other reason other than I'm familiar with Matabele people. But if you put in the title, risk of XYZ higher than normal in a Matabele population from Zimbabwe. I mean, are you really serving science? Are you really helping anyone? You could say just as easily, high allele frequency in a population in Zimbabwe or in a sub-Saharan population. So do you really need in your reporting to drill down so deeply? I absolutely respect that you need for genomic studies, for example, for many studies to have comparative study group, studies, participants who are cases, participants who are controls. They need to come from the same background often in studies. So sometimes you do need to report it. You need to report it in your methods section, for example. But there really is often not much benefit in sort of blazoning exactly which population this is across the heading, the titles and the blurb about your paper. You can bury it in the methods and not lose anything about the study you've done. So it's about thinking, if this were my population, or if this were my town's name or my suburb's name, how would I feel about this? Thinking about it just with a little bit more care, imagining what it's like for the people you're reporting about. So yeah, I think for us in Africa, I think often national is fine. A Ugandan population, a Kenyan population. I mean, you really don't need to go right in, say exactly who it is. So benefit sharing is something that people don't talk about much. I've alluded to it a bit. We also built a benefit sharing framework, and the idea of this, it's also published, it's out there, is to make it easier for researchers to plan benefit sharing and to recognize benefit sharing in their ongoing projects. So it's not anything amazingly new or exciting. It's more that we've tried to package it in a way that makes it very accessible for the average researcher who wants to run a study to think more creatively about how they can build in benefit sharing. So what we recognized a lot is that lots of people want to do benefit sharing. They think it's right, and they just have no idea where to start. So the framework is designed to help you. It's actually, it's sort of built like a matrix. I think I actually have So we used a socioeconomic model, which is a kind of epidemiological model that we adapted. And we made a matrix. So on the left here, you can see the types of benefits, financial, health, and well-being. So we did like a really intensive thematic kind of analysis to try and think of all the types of benefit we could think of and fit them under these themes on the left. And then we tried to identify who are all the stakeholders who might benefit. So we used the sort of grading from the individual, family, interpersonal, community, society, institutional, international, regional, national. So this is the kind of bit we borrowed from a sociological model, the spheres of influence. They also referred to the micro, meso, and macro levels of stakeholders. So this is just, it's not meant to be too technical. It was a way of organizing our thinking to help us identify who gets the benefits and what do the benefits look like. And if you have a look, the supplementary data of this paper is a big matrix, the 2x2 matrix, types of benefits along the top, and then the types of stakeholders down the side. So each cell you can go to and think about, and then there's a worked example showing you for genomic research, what are the different benefits that the different groups can get. And there's not always an entry in every cell, but at least it helps you to organize your thinking and work out if there is a potential benefit. And I think a lot of us do certain types of benefit sharing. We just maybe haven't worked out that that's what we're doing or been able to label it effectively. So it's about making benefit sharing more intentional and something you can plan upfront for every study and be really very deliberate about how you go ahead with it. Another favorite point of mine that I'm very boring on. So again, talking with a lens on under-resourced environments. So I certainly see in Africa, I see it in South Africa, there's a lot of very interesting research going on that generates actually piles and piles of data. There are lots of sequenced genomes, there are lots of genotype studies, but we run a parallel ecosystem to the health service. So we don't build in ways to ensure that those actually very useful health data, not only genetic, genomic, but for detailed clinical studies, cohort studies, we should be working out how we make sure those get back into the health service, because actually we can't afford to run a huge health data ecosystem for research and another under-resourced health data ecosystem for continuity of care and supporting provision of care. So we really need to think hard about how we can build bridges with our departments of health. And this is part of the governance of making sure we make best use of our data, is to make sure that we're not, and you know, people do these huge studies with very granular clinical data, and then the lead researcher wraps up and leaves, they publish their papers, and those data sets often go somewhere to, you know, disappear in a corner and die. And they certainly, all those health data never reach the healthcare professionals. Obviously, it has to be properly managed and has to be done well, but we should be thinking intentionally about these parallel data ecosystems and how we can make sure that we use our data well for participant care, their continuity of care. I just flagged, I've talked a bit about the big health data. This is our health information exchange at our Provincial Department of Health in the Western Cape. And this is very much a data warehouse that is designed for provision of care and continuity of care of individuals. And it's an absolutely fantastic achievement and an incredible resource for our Department of Health. And it was done in a kind of very collaborative way with the help of academics as well. So it's just, I put it there for people who are interested. It's just a nice, virtuous example that it is possible. Yeah. Scientific citizenship is also part of your ethics kind of branch, and that is about making sure that you engage with public audiences in a relatable way. And I think it was highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic how desperately we've actually failed as scientists to appear trustworthy, to appear knowledgeable, and to appear relatable to the general population. So if we're going to do ethical studies, we should be building in some kind of way to increase knowledge sharing in a way that's accessible to the general population. And I think that's also part of the ethics bundle, actually. If we're going to be collecting data and using it, we should be looking at how we're making our own efforts to give back and bring the population, the general population, along with us on the journey. Very briefly, this is just another kind of benefit. Career development and mentoring, again, in under-resourced areas. This is a benefit that can come out of all our projects. But if you have PIs who are hogging the limelight, they're not bringing up anyone along with them, they're not sharing authorship on papers, they're not helping to train junior people, then we're failing in terms of using the environment and the data for best benefit for everyone. So this is something that also is really, yeah, it's really essential. And it also falls under that sustainability piece. So I just put some of our publications, some that I've already shown you, but the slides I've shared, just in case they're useful. Legislation, we talked about a lot in my last talk. So I'm just going to remind you, this is normally you would have to look at your Protection of Personal Information Act, Health Acts, Human Rights charters and laws, and some of those are are international, and constitutional law. And these, although not every researcher likes to believe it, I mean, laws have to be obeyed. So if the law says you can't move identified health data without informed consent, you can't move it across borders, it's a law, and you can't actually argue your way out of those or around those. So I always put it in as a very clear pillar of its own, that they're actually laws and we are obliged and should be upholding all the way. Data access controls, I've split into two in this framework, procedural and structural. So procedural is about the processes you put in place to protect your data. So this might be having a specific way where people can request the data, specific standard operating protocols for how the data are reviewed, who must look at it, what must they look for. We log all the identifiers used in all the studies. So making sure you're capturing what happens to the data and provenance. So you know what moved where, what got altered, what got reversioned. So making sure that you know procedurally who's doing what with the data. So it's record keeping and it's admin and it's very boring, but it's really essential. And those protocols should be available to anyone who needs to see them. They should be easy to find. Yeah, we log all the queries, all the use of data, for example, from the data center. And it needs to be done systematically. So one thing we also discovered is that if someone approaches a data center or researchers for access to data, and that person says no for whatever reason, the requester will often go to someone else in the office and try again. So they'll call multiple people to see if they can find one person to say yes and give them access to the data. So you need the systems in place where there's only one channel and it's non-negotiable, that's the way you go. And that it's clear how the process works. So this is an example of a research data request process. Just what's the preliminary review, who has to sign off, what details are captured, when are they captured, what do we store, etc., before things go out. And then having a data sharing infrastructure where these things are stored and you can find them, and making those processes accessible and manageable. Because people who want to request data get frustrated if they don't know how to do it. And that's when they start to just try and find a friendly person in the back office who can help them. So you have to make it a very clear and accessible system so that you don't alienate your data users. Yeah, and then we need to address these different barriers, difficulty accessing the guidelines, the resources, all of these things that we also talked about on Monday, I think, yeah. Structural protection is about being on a secure server, being firewalled, having password protections, deciding who gets to see which fields. It's also about not emailing sensitive information around, but rather using secure data moving platforms. We've got one called Lift Server and another one called File Sender, I think, that are very secure, encrypted, etc. Encrypting all your hard drives, your backup drives, your little flash drives, whatever it is you use for your data. So it's the physical protections that you put in place and the password protections and those kind of things. And then very importantly, I did mention it before, the separation of identifying and attribute data. So what I mean by this is if you have a very large data set and you have some demographic data that could potentially be used to re-identify someone, their age, their date of birth, their place of birth, their parity, whatever. And then you have some very sensitive information, who's HIV positive, who has TB, who has diabetes. When you work with these data, you take anything that can be identifying and put it in one data set with an internal ID that doesn't have any meaning that can be linked back. And then you take the second bunch, which is the sensitive information, you put it in a separate data set with that internal ID. If you need to, you can rejoin. But if someone were to get hold of one of these data sets, they would either see a list of individuals or they would see a list of clinical data without any individual information. And then if you're emailing them around, well, hopefully you aren't, but if you're sending them on a Lift server or a platform to your collaborator, you send the one, you wait till it's cleared off the platform, and then you send the second one. So these two files never travel together. So yeah, here I showed just clinical data on the left, and then oh, sorry, no, yeah, clinical data on the left, identifying data on the right, and a linker so that you can rejoin them at the other end. And then finally, sustainability. This is also very unpopular. This is about documentation, data processing protocols, your paperwork, mapping your changes, versioning, control, checking that you know what's in every field, checking for duplication of fields, for example, in relational databases. So it's like your data, your kind of data hygiene, making sure that, and then with the documentation, making sure that if the person managing this data set walked away tomorrow, a new person could come and find their way around and be able to access things, provided they have the right permissions, of course. So there are a lot of very individual related data sets. If you want that data set, you speak to Mr. Brown over there, or Ms. Kamalo in that office can help you. It shouldn't be like that. It should be people agnostic, and it should be systematic. And that is very important for sustainability. And along with that, you need to have your backups in place. You need to have your disaster recovery plans and the more traditional sustainability issues. But it's very important, the documentation, versioning, those kind of things, and the data hygiene, those are part of sustainability to make sure you can keep using these data into the future. Standardization, we already talked about. This is part of sustainability. If you don't have standardized data, people can't use them onwards. And you're sending that data set somewhere to just die quietly in a corner, because it's not possible for people to work with it because they don't know what's in there. So you've got to do upkeep of your fields and your metadata, or some people call them code books. And this will increase accessibility and make sure it's feasible to do further analyses. And again, it keeps things person agnostic, because you don't need to ask me how I coded that field, because it's done in a standardized way. Oversight and enforcement, they're really difficult, actually. So oversight, you can have data access committees and ethics committees. Those are your main oversight over what happens to data. And enforcement really is very, very hard. I don't actually have any answers to this. So for example, in South Africa with the Privacy Act, we have the POPI, the Data Protection Office. There's a national officer who is the regulator, who would be the oversight. So if you suspect a breach, you can report it there. I haven't tried it yet, but it's a very difficult space, and it's not a space we're normally funded for, to actually have kind of follow up and chasing. So I don't have any answers for those, but it's something you should at least be discussing and understanding what to do if there's a data breach. The Department of Health has a very well crafted data breach plan. So if there's a new virus or something that appears, they go into action very quickly, and they've got a whole disaster management plan, and they lock things down, and they know how to cut off the servers, etc. So that's the kind of thing you can do for breach, but for people using data in a way you haven't authorized them to use it, that one's really hard. I suppose you have to watch the publication. So yeah, I think those, so the answer is how can we do data sharing? And I've been giving you different lenses on how we can do data sharing, practical lenses, ethical lenses. But I think the answer is really responsibly and mindfully. I just did this, it'll be very quick, it'll take 1 minute. So there was this guy, Harold Pollack. Has anyone ever seen this index card? This index card he put online years ago. I mean, I'm dating myself by even knowing it happened. And it was an index card on how to manage your finances so you can retire successfully. And his point was to put like these, however many, I think it's 14 points, and fit them on an index card. Do you even know what an index card is? The youth in the room? No. So it's a little white card with a red line and blue lines, and then people would use it to file stuff. I don't know, my daughter uses it for writing revision notes. She still uses index cards. So I tried to do data by specimen sharing index card for data governance. So I'll go through it quickly. Hopefully none of this will feel new to you by this stage. So the first point is the study participant knows what I'm using the health data for, and they're okay with it. Whether it's under broad or tiered or specific consent, at some level, they need to know that their data are out there being used by you. The ethics board knows what health data I'm using and how, and is okay with it. Well, that one you need to have a document in your hand. This data use complies with legislation. For us, it's the PUPPY Act and the Health Act. You would each have your own national acts that you need to know about. All data sets and drives are password protected and encrypted. Easy. So this is just saying some of the solutions. We use 7-zip sometimes. If you are an Excel user, it's actually easier to password protect and encrypt. BitLocker for drives. I mean, for work, I mainly use PC, so I'm not very Mac savvy, but find out. I'm sure there are lots of things that do these things for you. All participant identifiers are stored and transferred in a separate file to any clinical data. And that includes just demographic information, even if they're not uniquely identifying. So this is just reminding you of this idea of the 2 files with the linker. It's a bit of a clunky process to set it up, but honestly, it's just very much safer for everyone. All anonymized data cannot be re-identified. If it's something like genomic data and you can't guarantee that, you treat it always as though it's identified in the way you handle it and move, and share it, etc. This one, I never use email to transfer identifiable health information, and I always send passwords separately, not by email. I cannot tell you how many data sets have been sent to me where it says, I have password protected the data set, here's the password. And the data set is attached by email, which was already not safe, and then the password is in the email. So we actually often do it, we verbally call people and tell them the password, or we do it by WhatsApp. Because even if they write it down on a piece of paper, that's still safer than if it is in email. Yeah, use SMS, telephone call, never send passwords together with data. I mean, I don't know what else I can say other than just don't do it. Secure transfer platforms. And this one is really the final litmus test. If I were a study participant, I would be happy with the way my personal health data are being used. So I know we're all like very pro-research, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I can tell you that I'm not going to put my genome into 23andMe because I would not be able to tick that box. Yeah. So it's a very good bottom line test. And if you are extremely like, I don't care what happens to my data, then try and think about someone you know who really does care, and then substitute in there. If Nicki were a study participant, she would be happy with the way her personal health data are being used. Yeah. So I think that's it. This is my last talk. So it's a great opportunity to thank the organizing team and the ICTS hosts for the invitation to join you all here. I've really enjoyed it so far. I'm looking forward to the rest of the week. And then just recognizing my team members and collaborators, different working groups, and my funding. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nicki, for, as always, a thorough and, insightful talk that we probably need to record and, it'll be on YouTube, of course, but we need to consult it again. So any questions?
Hi, nice talk. So in one of the slides, you said that African population is genetically very distant. So could you comment on this?
Sure. So the reason the African genetics, the genomics of African populations are so, there's such high variety or variation in their genomes, and it's much more than, for example, in Caucasians, is because of the out of Africa hypothesis. So we had a population in Africa for a very long time before anyone left Africa and moved elsewhere. So if you imagine, so I do a thought experiment with my students actually. So imagine that we have in this room, we're all here, and at this moment there's the apocalypse. We're all here with our partners. Luckily, it makes it much easier and simpler. And then the apocalypse is over, and now it's our job to repopulate the world, right? So we pick one person and their partner, and we send them off to repopulate the world. What are the genetics of the rest of world population going to look like compared to the genetics of the population left in this room? It's going to be much less varied, because the people who went out there were just a tiny subset of the genetic and genomic diversity that we had left in the room. So it's the same in the Out of Africa hypothesis. We had already a large and varied African population, and then just a very small number of people crossed from Africa and essentially went and populated the rest of the world. There was some admixture, for example, with Neanderthal. So you don't find the Neanderthal admixture, we don't think, in most African populations. And then what are the other ones? Denisovan as well. It's an admix from a different group. But in general, well, I like to say it, I mean, I'm kind of teasing when I say it, right, with a sense of humor. But the rest of the world is just a rather small and boring genetic subset of what we have in Africa. So the genomes are much older, and because of that, much more diverse. And then we have the different populations. So we have much smaller haploblocks. Do you know what a haploblock is? So during meiosis, there's like rejoining, breaking and rejoining of chromosomes, and that happens at particular spaces along the particular points. It's not random. There's certain hotspots where the breaking and rejoining happens. And the distance between those hotspots are much smaller in Africans in general, because they have so much more diversity. Does it answer the question? Sorry. Here we are, son.
What about consent for retrospective data?
Sorry, what about?
Consent for retrospective data. How do, supposing 5 years ago, I've collected some data and I didn't imagine that I was going to use that at all. And now I want to use that.
So certainly under our legislation, if I've collected data, I can't just go back and reapproach those people once the study's over. So for my study that I have up where we're actually collecting samples, we have a specific clause that says, in the future, there may be additional studies and you might be eligible for those. If you're eligible for future studies, may we contact you and let you know so you can decide whether or not to join them. But if you don't ask for consent for recontact and the same for feedback of results, then you can't go there. Yeah. I mean, everyone's legislation is different, but if I've done a study and I didn't ask that I can contact those people again, I can't take that list and go and start calling them about other stuff. And it's such a simple question to add, but very few studies add it. No.
Anyway, I think she can hear me. So my question is around, if we collect information like say cord blood samples and then the baby samples, and we are following up a cohort, the consent is actually from the mom, and as we follow up, if we take measures and such on the baby and then we find out some information from the cord blood samples or whatever, what is our responsibility, and at what point, I mean, how much should we get consent saying we are going to collect the cord sample and we're going to follow up the baby, but how do we ensure that they understand what that actually baby, which may happen only many years into the cohort, right? By that time, the original consent may be 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Yeah, so there's no one answer fits all in these things. So this is something that, first of all, I would say that you sit with your ethics review board and you discuss at length, how are you going to manage adverse events or finding information? and how are you going to feed back findings? Which ones are you going to feed back? Which ones are you not going to feed back? So again, with our consents, we ask the participants a question and we explain sometimes we might find things that are relevant to your health. If we find those things, do you want us to tell you? And then we have two options. Sometimes we can find these things, but there's no treatment or cure. But sometimes there is a treatment or cure. Do you want us to tell you, A, if there's a treatment or cure available, or B, no, if there's, is it actionable or not? Sorry, I tied myself in knots. But we actually ask the individual, like, we might find something. Do you want to know? And do you want to know if we have a treatment available? And do you want to know if we don't have a treatment available? Because everyone's different. Yeah. And your first question was around
the
understanding. So personally, we do quite an informal pilot. We do translations of our forms, and then we pick a group of people who are not really in the field, and we have an informal chat. It's the same idea of ask your granny, So speak to someone in your community who would have a limited understanding of the field, ask them if they'd be willing to chat through. One of the other ones, we actually were all set to do this, and then we didn't get to do it because COVID. But we had funding to run a focus group. We had done the translations, and the idea was to have 15 individuals for whom the new language, that we translated into was their mother tongue, their original language. And then we were going to ask them to help us back translate it. And then use that as an opportunity during the back translation to say, so what does it mean to you? Does that make sense? If you back translate it, because it's one thing people reading through and saying, yeah, it's fine. It's another thing when people are actually actively wrangling with, how do I say this now? Does this make sense? What does it mean to me? So we were planning to have facilitated focus groups, asking the participants to help us with the back translation, and then using the opportunity for discussion, like, what does this mean to you? Does it make sense? So we just picked some, for example, some university staff who are maybe not in academic positions and who are not in our department in any way, to just say, when you read this, how does it sound? What do you think? And to probe a bit. So I think testing and piloting is probably the easiest way. And then I'm very lucky we just have brought on the team a genetic counselor who actually does our recruitment for us. So training your recruiters to make sure that they are comfortable explaining and they understand the need to really explain and take their time. So, you can't set them impossible targets for recruitment that doesn't give them time to spend with your participant. I don't know, there's no easy answer, sadly. It just takes work and caring enough to do the work, which I'm sure you do.
Thanks. Anyone else? So I had a question. You had some comment about, your checklist of, the questions that you should ask yourself first. The first one, I think, was, does the study offer any benefit to the population being studied? And then you said something about talking to anthropologists, if you have any doubts about it.
That was more, sorry, I don't know what I'm doing. That was, the anthropologist was more if you're really not sure about what's culturally accepted or not.
Okay. So I was just curious, what you think of anthropology as a field, because they actually do. In some of the pop science anthropologies, articles, they do, describe them as those people the sort of language that you were describing. And I don't think so maybe some of them work to benefit those populations, but in most cases, it's like studying a lab sample. That's what it comes across like. So
yeah, so definitely, I guess when I said that, I was thinking about local anthropologists who are part of the community. So maybe anthropologist is also the wrong word in that makes it sound very scientific, but people who are involved in the societal and cultural understanding of the people. But I would also say, so certainly for us, you would look for community leaders, people who are maybe local religious leaders, maybe local town leaders or population leaders, And even talking for health research, just talking to the nurses who run the clinics. I mean, that gives you as much insight as anything. You know, are people comfortable with this? Can you say that? Can you ask this? How should we set up, you know, where we sit and do this? Yeah. So it's really about local engagement at every level. Yeah.
Okay, thank you again, Nicki.
Thank
And,
you.
yeah. So we'll break for today.